Rain had been falling since dusk, not the kind that hammers or roars, just a quiet, ceaseless weeping from the clouds. The earth had long since turned to mud, and the wind carried no comfort, only the scent of wet wood and something bitter, like iron or memory. Etta Mae Holloway stood on the warped porch boards of her father's farmhouse, her shoes soaked through, the hem of her faded calico dress dark with rain and afterbirth. In her arms, the child stirred, wrapped in an old quilt she'd once stitched for someone else's baby. That child had died. This one had lived. And that, her father had said, was the problem. Inside, the light glowed faint through the kitchen curtain, casting a blurred yellow square onto the porch wall behind her. It was the only warmth left, and it wasn't for her. The door creaked open just a crack. Her father didn't step through. "You know what they'll say," he muttered, his voice heavy with what he wouldn't name. She didn't reply. "They'll say it even if you leave. But if you stay," his jaw clenched, "you'll make us complicit in the lie." She shifted the child in her arms. His skin was warm, dusky, with a tiny patch of curls already forming at the crown of his head. He didn't cry. He hadn't yet found the strength for it. "I never lied," Etta said. Her voice was hoarse. The labor had been long and quiet. No one had come. No one had been asked. "You lied the moment you let him touch you." Her father spat, slamming the door. She flinched, not from the sound, but from how easy it was for him. The porch light hadn't been lit that night, and now it flickered out altogether. Etta stood in the dark with a child who hadn't yet been given a name. Behind her, the house was silent. Not a curtain moved. Her mother never came to the window. She stepped down into the mud. The road to town was 7 miles and slick, but it was better to walk than to wait for the wind to carry her shame across the fields. By morning, the town of White Hollow had heard everything and confirmed nothing. That was how gossip worked. It didn't need proof, only tone. They said she'd had the baby in secret. They said it wasn't her husband's because she'd never had one. They said the child's skin was dark, which told its own story. And they said, though not always aloud, that a woman who bore a baby like that must have wanted it. And wanting it, in their eyes, was worse than anything else. The sheriff passed her by on the street, boots clean, hat sharp. He slowed just enough to meet her eyes, then tipped his brim with 2 fingers. Nothing more. Etta's stomach ached with hunger and bruising. She kept to the alleys and walked like a shadow, stopping only to feed the child in places where no one could see her breast. At the edge of town stood the old schoolhouse, windows broken, roof sagging. It wasn't a home, but it had 4 walls, and it didn't ask questions. She cleared a space in the back corner, away from the wind, used her shawl as a pillow. The cradle she dreamed of building stayed a dream. Micah, she had started to call him that, though only in thought, slept in the bend of her arm, his breath soft against her wrist. The nights were cold. The wood stove hadn't worked in years. She tucked her feet beneath her skirts and whispered stories, without endings, letting the sound soothe him, letting it soothe herself. She remembered the day it had all begun, or changed, or come to the surface. A Sunday afternoon in spring. A man asking for water, her hands shaking as she poured, his eyes, dark as turned soil, watching hers with gentleness, not hunger. And her kiss, stolen before fear could stop it. She hadn't seen him since, but the memory returned every time the baby blinked up at her with eyes that didn't match her own. The general store refused her. She'd offered lace, handmade from before the belly showed. Mrs. Tisdale had admired it once, said it was finer than anything in the catalog from St. Louis. Now, the woman frowned behind her counter, as if the thread itself had turned sour. "We're not in need at the moment," she said, her voice low. Etta looked down. She'd brought 3 handkerchiefs, embroidered edges, dandelions stitched in gold. "I could trade for milk. Or sugar." Mrs. Tisdale's eyes flicked toward the child in her arms. "You'd best ask at the mission. Or Reverend Calhoun. He's taken in others before." Etta turned away without answering. She didn't need a sermon. She needed bread. On the 4th morning, someone left a wooden box at the edge of the schoolhouse steps. Inside was half a loaf of sourdough, still warm, wrapped in cloth, a glass jar of milk, and a square of cloth with no name on it. but a carved edge that made her pause. Boaz. She said the name aloud, barely above a breath. He had been a saddle maker passing through that summer. Fixed her father's reins. Laughed with the children in the fields. He'd worn his solitude like a coat, heavy, weathered, and stitched with war scars. He never said much, but his hands had been gentle when he held the broken halter, and gentler still when they touched her waist, that one dusk when she hadn't run fast enough from her own hunger for warmth. She never told him about the baby. He had gone before she knew. Or maybe he hadn't gone, just disappeared in the way certain men do. Too quiet to chase. Now someone was feeding her. She didn't know if it was him, but the carved edge of the cloth matched the handles of her father's old saddle, the one Boaz had repaired. By the end of the week, the town's whispers grew thicker. The women stopped speaking when she passed. Children were pulled away by their elbows. One boy, no older than 7, stared at the baby and said, "Mama, why is that baby brown?" The mother clapped his ear and hissed, "Don't stare. That woman's not right with God." Etta didn't flinch. Not anymore. Her skin had hardened in places her heart had not. One night, after putting Micah to sleep, she walked out behind the schoolhouse to fetch kindling from the trees. The moon hung low, pale like bone, and in the brush beyond the fence, she saw a man standing still, just watching. She froze. But he didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a piece of the earth that had never left. Then he stepped back into shadow. She said nothing to the child when she returned, but she watched the door for longer than usual that night. On Sunday, she walked into church. The pews filled slowly, her steps louder than the organ. People turned. No one made space. She stood in the back. Micah slept on her shoulder. The hymn began. She sang. Soft but clear. It was a song she had known since girlhood, when her mother's voice rose sweet and high through summer windows. Now, no one harmonized beside her. After the benediction, she remained where she was, waiting for the others to leave. The Reverend walked past her without a glance. His Bible thudded shut under one arm. A woman from the choir brushed against her and muttered, "You should be ashamed." Etta looked her in the eye. "I am," she said, "but not for the reasons you think." The woman blinked, then turned. Etta stepped outside into the noon sun. The baby curled against her chest. The porch light of her father's house hadn't been lit that night, but there, on the edge of town, beneath a cottonwood tree, a man stood again. Same stance, same silence. She didn't wave. He didn't come closer, but she lingered longer before walking on. The road was no shorter. The child was no lighter, but something had shifted. Not in the town, not in her family, in her spine, in her breath, in the way she said his name, Micah, aloud, without apology. And somewhere, beyond the gossip, the judgment, and the shame, a quiet figure with calloused hands was remembering the woman who once offered him water without asking who he was. He hadn't forgotten her, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to return. The first frost came early that year. White Hollow woke beneath a silver veil, its rooftops sugar-dusted, the edges of window panes etched with lace no woman's hand had made. In the schoolhouse, breath showed in clouds. The baby's cheeks flushed pink in sleep. Etta wrapped him tighter, moving less to conserve what little warmth remained. By then, her name had withered to a whisper. No one said it aloud unless they were spitting. That girl, that woman, or just a glance and a tilt of the head. Etta Holloway had become a cautionary tale while still alive, proof that even good families could rot from the inside. What no one said, but many believed, was that she had done this to herself, that she deserved the cold and the shame, that her child was evidence, not life. She fed Micah what she could, bartered for goat's milk from an old trapper who didn't care about skin or scandal. For work, she hemmed shirts for travelers, cleaned tools for old Mr. Simmons at the livery in exchange for cast-offs and apple cores. But her pride stayed intact. Barely. No one offered her kindness, but someone offered silence. Every third or fourth morning, she found something resting at the threshold of the schoolhouse door. A bundle of kindling, a roll of clean muslin, once a carved wooden spoon shaped like a bird in flight. Never a note, never a name. just the unmistakable feel of intention. The work of someone who didn't need recognition to be good. She didn't speak of it, not even to herself. She only looked a little longer toward the tree line each morning. Sunday returned like an unwelcome memory. She hadn't planned to go again, but something stirred in her when she heard the faint chime of the church bell. A stubbornness, or defiance. So she dressed Micah in the cleanest swaddle she owned and walked a mile from the schoolhouse to town. The street was quiet. Most already inside, heads bowed, the kind of silence reserved for scripture and judgment. Etta reached the back steps and paused. Snow from the roof dripped in slow rhythm, falling like seconds. She stepped into the vestibule, her boots leaving wet prints on the wood. Inside, the air smelled of pine and old wool. Her fingers went numb the moment the warmth touched them. The congregation was already seated. Men in dusted coats, women in pressed gloves, all backs turned toward her, save for one or two who twisted just enough to catch her in their peripheral disgust. The organ sighed to life. Etta stepped down the aisle, head high, body trembling. No pew open for her. No hand gestured welcome. She found a place at the far edge of the last row, close to the wall, far from the altar. She held Micah against her chest, where his small heart beat against hers, like a match trying to catch. The hymn began. She sang, softly, not in rebellion but in refusal to be erased. Her voice cracked on the third line. She didn't stop. A little girl, 2 rows upturned in her seat. Her mother yanked her forward, too sharply. At the end of the service, no one stood until she had exited first. She waited in the courtyard, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she didn't want to be erased. Reverend Calhoun passed with a nod to the sheriff. Neither man looked at her. Only one figure lingered near the church gates. Boaz. He stood half in shadow, leaning against a wooden post, as if it were just another fence in another tired town. His coat was worn, shoulders broad, hat pulled low. But she knew the curve of his jaw, the stillness of his frame, the weight he carried behind the eyes. Their gazes met. He did not move. She did not speak. But something in her eased, like a tight thread cut free. Then, just as quietly, he turned and walked away. That evening, a woman came to her door. Gray bonnet, gloves, tight smile. "Miss Holloway," she said, voice clipped. "My name's Mrs. Keeley. I'm here on behalf of the Church Women's Circle." Etta didn't invite her in. The schoolhouse had no hospitality to offer. "We've gathered some items. For the child. Nothing personal, just necessities." She held out a basket. Inside, formula powder, some cloth diapers, a wooden rattle. Etta took it silently. Mrs. Keeley hesitated. "There's talk you might leave." "I haven't said that." "Well," the woman looked down. "People would feel more comfortable if you did." "I imagine they would." Mrs. Keeley's face pinched. "It's not personal, you understand. It's about the example." Etta looked down at her son. "Then let him be the example," she said, "that a child born without welcome can still be loved." Mrs. Keeley did not reply. She turned, stepped carefully around a puddle, and disappeared down the lane. Etta stood there long after the sound of her boots had faded. Over the next days, Boaz kept to the edges. He took work shoeing horses and fixing wheels. The men didn't ask about his past, and he didn't offer it. They called him Freeman, or you there. No one asked if he'd served in the war, or where his scars came from. They assumed. The town was always full of quiet assumptions. Boaz watched Etta from a distance, always with care, never possession. At the well, when she fetched water. At the bakery window, when she stared too long at the bread she couldn't buy. Once, he passed within arm's reach and didn't speak. Didn't stop. Just placed a single orange on the edge of the schoolhouse stoop before vanishing like a breath in fog. It was not romance. It was something slower. Something built of guilt, memory, and the ache of unfinished truth. He had loved her once. Or nearly had. Enough to remember the way her fingers trembled when she touched his sleeve. Enough to remember her lips, parting not from lust, but wonder. He had not known she'd carried his child. Not until he saw the baby. Not until he saw the skin and the eyes and the weight of silence wrapped around them both. The town's resentment fermented. One morning, the schoolhouse door was smeared with coal tar. A rag soaked in horse urine was left on the step. No note, just proof that kindness was too high a price. Etta cleaned it without a word. Micah in his basket, asleep beside her. Boaz stood by the trees again. He did not help. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew a woman forced to prove her worth would not accept rescue until it came on her own terms. But that night, after dark, he returned. He knocked once. She opened the door and said nothing. The baby was asleep. A fire crackled in the stove, barely warm, but there. Boaz stood on the threshold, hands rough, face unreadable. "I didn't know," he said. She didn't ask what he meant. He continued, voice low. "I should have written. Come back sooner." You don't owe me anything," she said. Too fast. "I know." He paused. "But I owe him the truth." She looked down at Micah, then back at Boaz. "He's not ashamed of you," she said. "That's enough." Boaz took a breath. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. He sat by the fire. Not close. Not with intent. Just there. Present. It was the first time she hadn't eaten alone in months. They didn't speak more than 10 words. But it was enough. The next Sunday, she returned to church. Boaz walked 10 paces behind her. The townsfolk noticed. They noticed how the sheriff looked up from his ledger, how the reverend fumbled his verse, how Mrs. Keeley clutched her gloves like a rope. Etta sat in the back again. This time, the baby cooed and giggled during the sermon, a sound that made 3 women turn in disapproval and 1 man smile in spite of himself. When it ended, Etta stood. Boaz walked down the aisle toward her. He didn't take her hand, but he stood beside her. A man, a woman, a child, nothing more, and everything that mattered. By sunset, the town had found a new way to whisper, but some whispered less cruelly. And that night, on her schoolhouse door, she found a scrap of folded linen with no message, only an embroidered corner of wild violets. A woman's stitching, a quiet gesture, a start. In the dark, Etta looked at Micah. "You are not shame," she whispered. "You are story. You are soil and seed, and the sound of forgiveness." He slept without knowing, without needing to know. Outside, the stars blinked through bare branches. Somewhere, in the hush between wind gusts, a man with a war behind him and a child ahead of him watched the old world shift. He didn't try to hurry it. He just stayed. By the time spring softened the frostbitten fences and coaxed green from the dead grass, the rhythm of their unspoken arrangement had settled into place. Boaz never knocked twice. He'd come at dawn or just after dark, always when the town still slept or the stars blinked like fading memories. He never crossed her threshold unless invited, and even then, only when necessary. He was not a man of words, but his hands were never idle. He repaired the cracked window pane with a scrap of oiled cloth and cedar, reinforced the schoolhouse door with nails pulled from the broken pews no one sat on anymore, left a whittled rattle beside Micah's sleeping form, carved from peach wood, shaped like a sparrow, a bird small enough to survive on crumbs, strong enough to cross deserts. Etta said little when she saw him, but her silences changed shape. They were no longer tight with fear or shame. They stretched, warm and uncertain, like waking limbs. Some days he left food. Some days, nothing but his presence. One afternoon, he brought a length of raw cotton and a needle threaded through the hem. "For his baptism suit," he said, eyes down. "I don't know when it'll be," she replied. "Doesn't matter," he answered, and turned back to his work without asking for thanks. Micah had begun to crawl by then. He was all knees and stubborn delight, his tiny laugh ringing out like wind chimes through the empty room. He had Etta's lips and her grandfather's dimple, but his skin held the sun even in the shade. When he laughed, it cut through the town's rusted gossip like water through ash. Some people began to forget their outrage. Some didn't, but it was harder to scorn a child who offered a smile before suspicion. Boaz watched him sometimes with a look Etta couldn't name. Not regret, not exactly. More like reverence with a bruise under it. He never tried to hold the boy unless asked. And Etta did not ask. Not yet. Instead, they found closeness in the margins. One evening, she found Boaz repairing the loose stones around the old well behind the schoolhouse. She brought him a cup of cold water, fingers brushing his as he took it. Neither pulled away. Neither commented. The sun set slow that night, smearing the horizon in orange and brass. They stood beside each other, shoulders almost touching, the silence steady as breath. "Did you ever think of staying?" she asked, eyes on the field beyond. "I thought of it every time I left," he said. She nodded. "But I thought I'd only break what I touched," he added. "You didn't break me." His throat moved as he swallowed. "You were already cracked," he said gently. "But you didn't shatter." The church women began bringing scraps of cloth again. Quietly. No apologies. Someone left fresh eggs on the step one morning. Boaz said nothing of it, but he noticed how Etta's back straightened, how she swept the schoolhouse more often, sang to Micah in a voice no longer threadbare. The town's judgment, though not gone, began to shift like snow under thaw. It melted slowly in patches. Not warmth, exactly, but the end of a long freeze. Still, not everyone thawed. Sheriff Pike passed Boaz outside the mercantile and spat tobacco inches from his boot. "You think fixing her porch makes you a husband?" he sneered. Boaz didn't reply. "Man like you should know his place." Pike continued. "Ain't here." Boaz turned calm. "My place is where my child sleeps." Pike's lip curled. "Ain't been no court says he's yours." Boaz didn't raise his voice. "Don't need court for truth." "You trying to stir things up? Walking beside her like you belong." Boaz met his gaze, still quiet. "I walk beside her because I do." The sheriff didn't answer, but his hand twitched near his belt, and Boaz knew the man had no bullets big enough to kill what had already survived. One morning, Etta found a small bundle at the edge of town. Inside it, Micah's carved cradle. She hadn't seen it in over a year. Her father had burned the old one after the birth, said it carried sin in the grain. But this one was new, handmade, smooth polished and sturdy, with tiny stars carved along the rail. At the bottom, etched so faint she almost missed it, were the initials BF. She ran her fingers over the letters. They were barely deeper than dust, but felt heavier than any name she'd carried before. That night, as Boaz sat by the stove, whittling a spoon from birch scrap, she set the cradle beside him. "You made it," she said. He nodded, not looking up. "For him, for both of you." She waited. Then, "I used to believe Micah was a punishment." Boaz looked at her now, still. "I don't anymore," she said. "But I didn't believe I deserved goodness either." "You do." His words were quiet, firm. "But you left." "I was afraid," he said, "of being seen, of staying, of what people would do to him, if they knew. They already knew. I didn't want you to carry the weight of me, too." She stared at him. "You were never a weight." For a long time, neither moved. Then she reached across the space and took his hand. Rough, weathered, calloused like barn wood, warm like spring. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. Micah began to walk soon after, wobbly steps between their knees, laughter like wind bells. Boaz called him Little Drum because his steps always announced him before his smile did. They shared meals more often now, shared silences, shared repairs and laughter and, slowly, trust. But love, if it had a name, was still something unspoken. Not because it wasn't there, but because some things grew best in quiet. Etta stitched again, this time not for trade, but for herself. For Micah. She embroidered violets on his sleeve. Not because she liked flowers, but because someone once left her a stitched cloth with that same bloom. The memory had softened. People still whispered, but their voices were smaller, drowned out by the child's laugh, the cradle's creak, the ring of Boaz's hammer on wood. Then came the letter, pinned to the schoolhouse door. Torn paper, ink smudged. From Reverend Calhoun. "It is not fitting, nor moral, that a woman unwed be living with a man not her kin. There are talks of sin, of scandal. Remove yourself, or the church will press formal charges with the sheriff." No signature, just the seal of the church women's circle at the bottom. Boaz read it and said nothing for a long while. Then, folding it carefully, he placed it in the fire. It curled, blackened, vanished. "I won't leave again," he said. "I won't ask you to," she replied. And something shifted then. Not loud, not fiery, just the kind of shift the earth makes before blooming. A week passed, then another. No word from the Reverend, but the tension thickened. Side eyes returned. Doors stayed closed. Etta stood firm. So did Boaz. They didn't speak of marriage. Not yet. But he began to build something behind the schoolhouse, a small addition, made of pine and stubbornness. One room, a place with a door and a window and walls where Micah could hang drawings that weren't shameful. The townsfolk pretended not to notice, but the sheriff watched. So did Mrs. Keeley, and so did a quiet child with ribbon braids, who left a single apple on the schoolhouse step and ran before Etta could say thank you. The storm came the night before Pentecost. Wind tore across the prairie. Rain pelted like gravel. The roof leaked. Etta and Micah huddled by the fire. Boaz braced the walls, moved furniture against the doors, kept the flames alive. In the middle of it, a tree fell outside. Thunder shook the sky, and Micah laughed. Laughed like the world hadn't tried to erase him. Like storms were stories, not threats. Etta looked at Boaz then, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the man, not the mistake. The shelter, not the shadow. "You're not the man I remembered," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe you're not the woman I left." "I hope I'm not." Silence again, but this time it felt like peace. By morning, the storm had passed. The town had taken some damage. The church roof had lost a shingle. A fence collapsed near the post office. No one died, but the world had shifted again. Boaz stood in the doorway, watching the sunrise. Etta came up beside him, Micah in her arms. The boy reached out toward him, babbling, and for the first time, Etta passed him over. Boaz took Micah gently, held him against his chest. The child laid his head there and sighed, not because he knew who Boaz was, but because he knew he was safe. And for now, that was enough. The sky broke just after noon, not with rain or thunder, but something quieter, something slower, like a held breath finally released. Etta stood on the steps of the schoolhouse, Micah balanced on her hip. His fingers curled into the neckline of her dress. He was warm, solid, heavy in that way only the truly loved become. Across the dirt road, a rider approached. Dust at his heels, coat flapping behind him like a threat. Sheriff Vernon Pike. She did not flinch. Boaz stepped from behind the door before she could speak, a hammer still in his hand. He did not raise it. He did not have to. The sheriff pulled his horse short, eyes hard, jaw tight. "We had an agreement," he said flatly. "No," Boaz replied, calm as ever. "You gave a threat and called it peace. Then consider this notice. She's to vacate by Sunday. Church board's decision. Formal this time." Etta shifted Micah against her chest. He stirred, sensing the tension. Boaz's voice dropped. "What law have we broken?" Pike's smile curled like sour milk. "You're not her husband. That child's a scandal. You're building a home with sin as the foundation." The hammer in Boaz's hand didn't move, but his fingers curled tighter around the handle. "She's done nothing but survive," he said, "and I won't let you make her pay for it again." "You threatening me?" "I'm answering you." The sheriff leaned forward in the saddle. "You think this town will side with you?" Boaz looked past him, to the road, to the sky, to the horizon where the sun was rising clean and gold. "I don't need them to. I just need you to step back." Pike didn't speak again, but his boots hit the ground with more force than needed. He dropped a folded paper at his feet and rode off without turning. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to read it. The fight had already begun. That night, Boaz sat on the edge of the schoolhouse bed, Micah snoring softly nearby. His hands were scraped, his knuckles raw from days of work, not fists. Etta knelt beside the cradle, adjusting a blanket. Her fingers moved with ritual. "Grace, they won't stop," she said softly. "I know. They'll come when it's loud enough to draw others." Boaz watched her. "Then we'll make them hear something different." Morning came with fire, not from a match or malice, but from Etta's choice. She dressed in her cleanest gown, pressed her shawl, braided her hair, held Micah close, and walked the full stretch of White Hollow's Main Street. The townsfolk watched from behind curtains, from storefronts, from pews. Boaz walked beside her, silent, not behind, not ahead, beside. They reached the church as the bell rang for Sunday prayer. Reverend Calhoun stood at the door, pale, rigid. "This is not your place," he said. Etta met his gaze. "This is where I was baptized, where my mother sang hymns, and my father preached righteousness. You do not own this threshold." Boaz laid a hand on her back. She stepped forward. Calhoun's mouth opened, then shut. They entered. Pews were full. Whispers slithered. One woman gasped. A man dropped his Bible. Etta did not flinch. She walked to the front, laid Micah's cradle down before the altar, and stood tall. "This child is not a sin," she said, voice low but unshaking. "He is love that had no place, and now he does." Boaz stepped forward, his voice steadier than iron. "I am his father, not by court, not by blood alone, but by the choice to stay when no one else would." Gasps. One cough. A tremble for Mrs. Keeley in the third row. Boaz continued. "I left once, not from shame, but fear. But I came back to the place where I'd left something worth holding, and I found her still standing." He turned to Etta. "You have carried everything alone. Not anymore." She met his eyes. The church had never felt holier. Reverend Calhoun cleared his throat. "This isn't proper," he managed. "No," Etta said gently. "It's not, but neither was what was done to me." A murmur rippled, like something cracking. Boaz reached for her hand. She gave it, and with the child between them, they stepped down, past the pews, past the silence, past shame. Outside no one followed, but no one stopped them either. And for once, the whispers did not sting. They simply scattered like dust in morning light. At the schoolhouse steps, Boaz paused. "I've wanted to ask something." Etta turned. "I don't have a ring," he said, "or much to offer." "You gave us your hands," she said. He nodded. "Will you take my name?" he asked. "I'll take your promise," she replied. And in that moment, with Micah giggling in the wind and the sun warming the roof of what had once been ruins, Etta smiled for the first time without apology. They didn't kiss. Not then. They just stood still, together. And for once, the world felt still too. To you, watching now from wherever life has scattered you, listen close. Some women carry shame that was never theirs to begin with. Some children are born into silence and left to bloom without applause. But somewhere out there, a man with calloused hands and a quiet soul may still choose to stay when no one else does. And that is how sky breaks open, not with thunder, but with love that holds its ground.